to our 1 o'clock CME Palooza session. This is the first session I haven't had to restart my laptop right at the beginning of it, so I'm feeling pretty good, pretty confident so far. This is our Back to the Future of CME session, sponsored by Haymarket and my CME, moderated by Lawrence Sherman. I will turn things over to Lawrence in just a minute. I should actually bring up the slides so everyone can see them. Here we go. First off, though, the reading of our sponsors. A big thank you to our gold sponsor, Academic CME and Med Learning Group, and our silver sponsors, ASIM, Creative Educational Concepts, Global Education Group, Haymarket Medical Education, as we already mentioned, Infograph Ed, Medscape Education, PER, and Prova Education. And then our bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, ACHL, Antidote Education Company, Catalyst, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Global Academy for Medical Education, Helio Education Lab, Integrity Continuing Education, Integritas Communications, Paradigm, Peer Audience, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, Primary Care Network, PVI, Red Med Ed, and RMEI Medical Education, and Vindigo. Our speaker disclosure slide, opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are not our own and do not represent an endorsement by or position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And lastly, there are 2 ways that you can ask questions. But Derek, you say there used to be 3. That's true, but we got rid of the Google Slides thing because no one used it and it was just a pain. So now we just have 2 ways, so less options. You can use the CME Palooza text line, 267-666-0CME, or you can always tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring the questions during the session, so feel free to use either one of those methods. Real quick before I turn it over to Lawrence, this has been going pretty well. I just give the warning, I have had a few laptop issues, so I may disappear and come back in. So these guys are aware of it. This one seems to be going pretty good. The session will continue even if I'm not on, which I don't know what that says about me. But be that as it may, I think that is all I have for now. So Lawrence, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Derek. And thank you to you and Scott for actually inviting us back, because we did this session with one other person. And thank you for blocking out my other 2 panelists while I talk.
Sure.
No, go ahead, put that back. We did this session 5 years ago, and the session was, what will CME look like in 5 to 10 years? And your thought, good, Eugene, you're popping up over the welcome. We really had a chance to think about what went on, and we thought we'd like to come back halfway through that 10-year period and see what we're doing. So we're going to channel Bon Jovi and say, halfway there, we're living on a prayer. Sometimes in CME, we pray a lot, but the reality is I think we've accomplished a lot in the last 5 years. Some of our panelists are using slides, and yeah, seriously, they're using slides. And were you pointing to yourself? And
yeah, I'm using slides, and Eugene is using slides.
And we thought we would spend some time reflecting, reviewing, and readdressing. What did we say? How close did we get to what actually happened? And do we want to readdress what may be happening? And there's a 4th R for me, which is rebirth. Some of you may know I had a little burst appendix in the interim and almost died. So it gave me an opportunity to reflect a lot on CME and other stuff. So some of the comments that I will make may come from that part of me, not my appendix, but the part of me that was reborn. So it's really important. Eugene, our intrepid reporter on the streets of Barcelona, has his curtain pulled back so we can see the protests going on today. And Eugene, if we see something coming through the window, we'll just tell you to duck. With any sound delay, you won't hear it, and then it'll just be the 3 of us. Derek will cut you out of the picture. So what we'd like to start with is, how did we do? And what we're going to do is Kathy is going to reflect upon what her predictions were and the rest of the predictions, and really get a sense of where are we today. Eugene's going to do the same, then I'm going to go. Then we'll come back and say, okay, how'd we do? Did we get it right? Did we get it wrong? And what do we think CME is going to look like 5 years from now? And things are moving pretty quickly, so we really appreciate the opportunity to be able to do this. And with that, Kathy and Eugene, I'm going to ask that you each introduce yourselves, say who you are. I will say I'm Lawrence Sherman. I work in international development for the Association for Medical Education in Europe. I also have a small consulting company called Meducate Global, and I am happy to be the moderator and to hit mute. And I turn it over to you, Kathy.
So I'm Kathy Chappell. I'm a Senior Vice President at ANCC. I'm responsible for our accreditation program, so both our continuing nursing education and our interprofessional accreditations. I'm responsible for our residency and fellowship programs for nurses and advanced practice nurses, our certification department, and our research and quality departments.
So I'm Eugene Pozniak. I'm Managing Director of CME Learning. It's been running now for 13 years. It's become the first non-US organization to be accredited by the ACCME a few years back, and we got our reaccreditation a couple of years ago. And I also run the European CME Forum, which is now in its 12th year. We have the 12th annual meeting coming up in just a few weeks' time in my hometown of Manchester, UK. So I've been active in CME, especially in Europe, but work globally since February 2000. So in 4 months' time, that'll be the 20-year mark.
Okay.
It's you, Kathy.
You want me to start? All right. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for inviting us back, and go Washington Nationals. So for the Phillies, Lawrence for the Mets, and Eugene, this is about baseball, which I think you're a little bit aware of. The Washington Nationals made it to the World Series in a suite of St. Louis. So very happy to be back. As I reflected on Back to the Future, and the title was Of CME, I actually cringed a little bit, because I think it's really about CE or CPD that is broader than just continuing medical education. But as this is CME Palooza, I understand why it was titled what it was. So I'm going to have to say that, okay, perfect. So I started looking back at our original presentation and what did we predict for the future. One thing that struck me immediately was how young we looked 5 years ago as compared to where we are today. But it was fascinating to look at what we thought was going to happen in the future and what actually happened today. So next. And thanks to Lawrence, hopefully you all will get the implications of this, but I photoshopped Lawrence into the Back to the Future 2, and looking at this from a journey of what has been the past, what's the present, and what we see for the future. So next slide. I also reflected a lot on my experiences as part of teams. A lot of what I talked about in the last session was about interprofessional education and interprofessional continuing education. And this is one of the teams that I started out. I worked in a hospital in Washington, D.C. during the height of some real significant drug violence. This was the trauma team. I will say we don't look very diverse, other than the one male nurse at the back. And I think that that's something that I hope will change in the future. So next slide. So these were the hot topics that I reflected on upon reviewing the presentation. So I spent a lot of time on what is and what distinguishes interprofessional education from single profession CE. That came through, I think, in several of the questions. At the time, I don't think I was using the term interprofessional continuing education as compared to interprofessional education. And that's been an evolution. Interprofessional education, to me, is primarily in the academic or pre-licensure arena, and interprofessional continuing education once you get into practice. We talked a bit, and people asked questions about why is interprofessional education or continuing education important. Talked about whether time should be a metric for learning. We certainly award credit based on time, and is that right, or should we be doing something different? Had some conversation about the value of CME and CPD to the learner, to the organization, I think to patients. Questions about how to best get people engaged in interprofessional education or continuing education. There are anecdotally some stakeholder groups that just don't come to the table as readily as others, and that was a theme of conversation. We talked about incorporating the patient's voice into education, and I'll share a little bit about movement in that area. And then what is the value proposition for CE credit? So next slide. So when in 2014, I had shared information about Joint Commission's errors in the clinical setting, particularly related to teamwork. And I think that is certainly a driver that continues behind interprofessional education and interprofessional continuing education. And as much work as has been done in the clinical setting, this headline from March 2019 on Vanderbilt being hit with a $25.5 million suit over a wrong site surgery today really should never be happening. But there's also more of an emphasis on health and well-being of the healthcare workforce and using CE or CPD to address public health crises. And I think that's been an evolution in why investment in interprofessional education is critically important. You go next slide. People asked about what were the outcomes of interprofessional education or continuing education, and this was in 2014. I'd shared some of the outcomes from our jointly accredited providers who we know are doing interprofessional education because they've been vetted through a peer review process and are now accredited to award, to develop and then award actually a particular type of credit that I'll share. But since 2014, there was a systematic review that was published by Scott Reeves and colleagues that really talked about the outcomes related to interprofessional education and interprofessional continuing education. And he had done a systematic review much earlier, which only focused on the academic interprofessional education. This, almost 50% of this, I think 40% was related to what's happening in the practice setting. So for those of you that are interested in outcomes, and this was a real rigorous review, it's a great resource. And since that time, we've also had 3 leadership summits. We actually had a 4th, but we've had 3 reports published through the Joint Accreditation Program that talk about what our jointly accredited providers are doing. I put the link here. They do talk about what's the infrastructure related to interprofessional education, what is research and how do you disseminate your findings, and then how do you evaluate the impact of interprofessional education. These are all free resources that you can download, so I wanted to share those with you. So next, looking at time as a metric for CE credit, I think we can all agree that sitting in a seat or time is not truly a measure of learning. And within ANCC, we started to look at developing a different conceptual framework or a different model, looking at an outcome-based CE credit system that was completely divorced from any time metric. So this is a conceptual framework that we developed. We actually have now providers developing and awarding an outcome-based CE credit. One of our challenges, and providers are able to do that, and learners truly, it resonates with learners that I'm trying to demonstrate I know something or apply it in practice or demonstrate an impact of change in practice on patient outcomes. One of the areas that we have struggled a little bit is licensing and certifying bodies recognizing this type of credit, because particularly in the regulatory realm, credit is often written into regulation in a time-based model. So we're starting to look at how do we advocate for regulatory bodies to change. But I do believe, and at least ANCC believes, that this is a path forward. I don't think it's an all or nothing. I think people will always have a time-based model to some extent, but having an outcome-based model actually expands options and I think is more valuable for our learners and the organizations that they sit in. So the value of CME and CPD, Ron Severo, who's done his professional career, has been really looking at CE and CPD and implications on practice change and patient outcomes. published this systematic review that's available on ACCME's website. But you're also seeing many other organizations look at CE and CPE as a strategic asset for their organization to implement practice change and also to improve patient outcomes. And you're also seeing, or I'm also seeing and participating in organizations that are collaborating that hadn't been before. So across professions, the N-Cycle group is a very heterogeneous group of organizations, both in academia and practice, looking at the clinical learning environment, particularly where residents, nurse, medical residents, pharmacy residents train, but how do we enhance the clinical learning environment for the benefit of all? Because at the end of the day, even if you're in current practice, you're continuing to learn. Several questions came up in 2014 about what does interprofessional education look like? What are the elements? And so this is a snapshot of what, at least from the joint accreditor perspective, we would define an interprofessional continuing education activity. So members of 2 or more professions that are reflective of the target audience, and where the goal is to change skills, strategy, or performance of the healthcare team or the impact of the team on patient outcomes. One area that we have highlighted with more rigor is an opportunity for learners to learn from, with, and about each other. So in order to develop high quality interprofessional continuing education, learners have to talk to each other. They have to engage. And that's an area that we have continued to emphasize, and seeing our jointly accredited providers do a fabulous job in this area. We've also incorporated the patient's voice. So from ACCME, which is the first criterion, the Joint Accreditation Program, which is the second box, and ANCC is the third box, we've used engaging the patient as a component of our criteria for commendation or for distinction. And I think continuing to reflect how important it is for patients to be involved at the beginning of planning, not just that who sit on a panel and reflect their experiences, but engaging in the planning process and as teachers. And then the value of credit. So we all use credit as an incentive in some ways to engage people in participation in continuing education, though I would argue credit is a currency that is, certainly our state boards and our certifying bodies require, but there is research that says people participate in continuing education whether you give them credit or not, because they are self-motivated adult learners. One thing that has been added since 2014 is interprofessional continuing education credit. So that means that activity was deliberately planned by and for the team, and that credit mark can be used in conjunction with the single profession credit, so that the state medical boards, the certifying bodies, even somebody's own organization can identify an activity that was planned by and for the team. This has been endorsed by the Federation of State Medical Boards. It's been presented to the National Council of State Boards of Nurses, and it has been accepted by the Georgia State Board of Pharmacy, which is new. It does go into looking at regulations. Some regulations for physicians, for example, might say CME credit is required, but if the regulation says continuing education credit is required, then this can easily be adopted by different regulatory bodies. And finally, looking at what's been happening within organizations that are pursuing becoming jointly accredited. So interprofessional continuing education, they believe, is important to their own organization or their learners. I think in 2014, I'm gonna have to look down at my own, we had 3 applicants. During that year, you can see the significant growth in organizations that are pursuing joint accreditation, demonstrating, I think, the value proposition, and then the types of organizations that are applying. So they're quite diverse. Academia, those in education. I think those in the practice setting are the ones that we see operationalizing the patient outcomes to the greatest extent. but certainly we continue to see a diverse group that's pretty consistent year over year. And the last thing that I wanted to share are the types of professions. So with joint accreditation, you automatically, an organization has the ability to award continuing medical education, pharmacy education, and nursing education credit. But since that time, we've added 4 other professions. So through one accreditation, you can award up to 7 different types of CE credit. So we've added the optometrists, the social workers, the PAs, and the psychologists. And this just represents the number of organizations that have chosen to add the additional credits to their portfolio of CE. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Eugene.
Great, thanks very much, Kathy. So I've just added a couple of words here to actually talk about back to the future of CME in Europe. So my focus will be once again specifically in Europe. And thinking back to 2014 and you know, where we were at that stage, actually on reflection now, I'm thinking, well, in fact, I was rather depressed. Just looking at what was going on in Europe at that time, it was yeah, we were swimming through treacle, I think. So in the next slide, I started to sort of identify the topics, the hot topics at that time. And there's a lot of discussion about the value of CME, the value of the CME credit, and then each country, each system had this all done in a different way. There's a lot of talk about harmonization, but in the context of just recognition of credits across borders. So it was a conversation that the accreditation bodies may have been talking about, but very little was happening at that stage. There was talk about engagement of learners, but thinking back now, actually the whole environment was probably holding the opinion of learners very low in their priorities. And as far as a lot of people were asking about how to develop educational activities, but there wasn't much guidance at that time. So I think with the next slide, I was, yeah, this is summarizing sort of where we were. So CME was in stasis. The idea of CME in Europe came about in 1999. The first systems, I think it was in Portugal. The UK had something going in the late 90s. Then the pan-European stuff got going from 2000. But that idea was the same, and nothing much changed over the next 13, 14 years. Just as we were coming into 2014, the European Commission, you know, the civil service that supports or that runs the European Union, spent 2 years looking at CME across Europe, and they decided that they had no influence over it. They had no interest other than telling the authorities across the countries, you must recognize CME, and it's a good idea to have a CME system. So in effect, they pulled back from that. The accreditation bodies were still accrediting activities by industry and medcoms agencies, the agencies of the pharmaceutical industry. Education providers were struggling to be recognized as a group, and this was a regular theme of several presentations I was giving at that time. I went back to the original CME Palooza then and managed to come across a number of presentations I was giving then. And I just recalled how I was frustrated at how accreditation bodies or industry or medical societies just did not recognize educational providers as a thing. I've kept medical societies unimaginative. I think still at that stage, medical societies were still coming out with the same old didactic lectures. They were starting to evolve, but things still weren't moving. Industry, the commercial interests, by way of pharma and med tech, were confused. There's little direction elsewhere, and if they were looking to industry to support financially CME, there was little guidance there. And around that time as well, in 2014, just as a shorthand saying sort of scandals overlooked, there's a little hiccup, let's say, in the UK, where pharmacists, their purchasing pharmacists across hospitals were allowed to engage in very, very dodgy practices. And as soon as it sort of overlapped with CME, or there was an opportunity to use a scandal to improve the environment, it was just overlooked. It was swept under the carpet, and we moved on. And there were several conversations that took part around those years that were a little frustrating. And this is a cartoon that I borrowed from a dear colleague, and thank you, Sophie. And I do love it. It just sort of summed up, I think, the environment that we were living under. So, and I'd like to really just sort of look at the next 5 years then and what happened. A number of things have brought us to where we are today, and I'll look at each group individually. So the first lot, we've got the commercial interests, actual industry. So soon, around the time in 2014, in the US, of course, the implementation of the Sunshine Act came about, and in the UK, across Europe, we had a similar thing with the FPA responsible transparency that kicked in 2015, just a year later. And over those next few years, for the first time, actually in FPA's history, FPA is the overarching sort of the umbrella regulatory body for the pharmaceutical industry, specifically in Europe. And most of their communication, so it's like pharma in the US, most of their communication with their member organizations is either through the leadership of the drug company or a nominated representative of the drug company. But for the first time, they actually looked at medical education and said, no, let's create a task force and look at how industry interacts with medical education in Europe. So that task force started ticking over the next few years. There's a great paper that came out as a result of a lot of those conversations, authored by Alan et al., published in the Journal of European CME. So if you just go to jecme.eu and head on to the most read article so far in the journal, it's got a lovely description of how the pharmaceutical industry in Europe can fund education. And we're interested in the difference between what the paper calls type B and type D funding. One is completely arm's length independent education, and the other is disease area education that's still controlled by the supporting company. So that's a sort of a go-to paper, and the conversation started. There was a change in that regulatory environment sort of halfway in the 2 to 3 years ago. We saw a move of grant offices or the grant officers from the US to the US from a compliance perspective. And I put a question mark there, 2017, 2018. There is a significant move there. If you want to get a grant funding for a European educational program, the chances are there will be some kind of US involvement, and that's to support the compliance side. Then in 2018, these new FPA and ethical medtech, so the medtech side, device diagnostics side of the commercial interests in Europe, the standards started to come out. They were written down and launched at the beginning of 2018, creating guidance between the difference between sponsorships, independent grants, and partnerships. And of course, most recently, just a few months ago, we saw the launch of the FPA code. And for the first time there is a paragraph on how member companies can support medical education in Europe. So there's a lot of movement there in those 5 years, really reflecting the change in the regulatory environment. So if we go to the next slide, we can see there, we'll sort of review the accreditation body side of things. So in the last CME Palooza, I spent some time describing the different ways of getting an activity accredited in Europe. We have largely an accreditation system that accredits activities rather than providers. And the NAAs, the National Accreditation Authorities, have started to make huge rounds actually in Europe. I've singled out Germany and France. I mean, France is still needing to, they're about to launch a CME system there, but they are really reviewing what's going on across the world, not just across different countries in Europe and pan-European, but the level of discussion that's taking place where they're looking to tie in CME with some kind of competence of the physicians themselves, performance, patient outcomes, is very interesting. Germany had a system that's sort of moved on, whereby even in the past few months, they're actually identifying providers who are misbehaving. Let's say they're not meeting the standards of the German accreditation requirements, and actually closing them down. I was going to say driving them out of business, but it's become such a serious thing. They can identify organizations that are not actually maintaining the standards, bringing them to the fore, and actually not tolerating it. And in the UK, there are changes afoot here. There is more CPD approval and accreditation that's going on, and some of the 24 royal colleges and faculties that we have, similar to the boards that exist in the US, we've got a similar thing in the UK, and each of these royal colleges and faculties are responsible for certification, accreditation of activities, and they're looking in much greater depth of how they're accrediting activities as funding for CME is going, independent funding is going into the system. And they are looking to withdraw from accrediting drug company created education and also the medcoms environment. Then UEMS, ACCME have changed their standards. They've moved a little bit slower than others. However, they have probably made the first step towards provider accreditation in Europe by accrediting platforms. That might irritate a few people actually using the provider accreditation terminology with this, but actually if you look at the system, they evaluate the e-learning platforms that providers come up with, and if the provider actually generates enough, it's something like 10 activities on a platform, then the UEMS, EACCME is actually what it should say there, EACCME should, they then accredit the platform, and the provider has a period of time where they can upload what they self-certify to this within this system. And I can see, Derek, that there's a question that's come in. I can address this. Good timing. Yeah, there's a simple question that's come in: is are things better now? I think we'll come to that. But as a shorthand, things are getting better, I think. But if we cover these next couple of slides, hopefully I'm painting that picture. No, go back one, Derek. Sorry. Because the ESABs, there are the European Specialty Accreditation Boards, which we've seen some major moves here, with EBAC is now getting recognition across the Atlantic with the Canadian Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, and EBAC has, in the past year or 2 years ago, achieved substantial equivalency with the AMA, ACCME, and just a few weeks ago has now in place a mutual recognition procedure with the AMA for mutual recognition of CME credits, which previously was just the unique purview of the EAC CME. It's now, the AMA, you can go to the international CME page on the AMA website, which is now just opening it up to any competent accreditation body across the world can apply to go through the process to achieve this with the AMA. So staying with accreditation bodies, I mean, individually they've been working like that. However, for the next one, as a group, next slide, in collaboration, we've seen groups coming together. There's a group, the CMEEA, where a number of the ESABs have got together and they've published some joint statements on standards and requirements that you can read in JECME. But the really interesting one, I think, discovering, so where we can see things are getting better, is this International Academy of CPD Accreditors. There's an annual meeting they run now, the Cologne Consensus Conference, driven by the European Cardiology Section Foundation in Europe. The ACCME is another driver, and also the Royal College of Physicians Surgeons Canada as well. So these three organizations are moving forward with the Cologne Consensus Conference, where accreditation bodies are getting together and looking at global standards. So under the IACPET, this International Academy of CPD Accreditors. Very interesting website to visit to see which global organizations are there. And they had their meeting about 2 months ago, where they really came out with where they started really delving into accreditation standards and also the requirements they're expecting from providers and others active in that CME space. So this is coming up to the end of the 5 years, developments over the past year to 2 years. Okay, and then finally, the providers themselves and the medical societies, the medical associations in Europe are looking at CME as a separate activity, and whether it's on the accreditation side, the compliance side, measuring outcomes of what they do, we've seen that over the past 5 years, they are getting much more aware, knowledgeable, and active in that CME space. And the professional providers, the private education companies, again, have started to get that recognition. They still need recognition from certain CME accreditation bodies that explicitly state in their standards that they accredit activities from netcoms agencies, which is incredibly dangerous. They're agents of the pharmaceutical industry. What they mean is the professional providers, the providers who can work independently with grant funding and have nothing to do with the promotion of specific products. And looking at the hot topics today, I think, as Kathy did, sort of reflecting on what we talked about in 2014, and as we're getting to this point now in 2019, I think that the hot topics are all roughly still the same. There is a lot of discussion about the value of CME and the value of the CME credit, especially the International Academy of CPD accreditors. So the context of their conversation is now shifting this dialogue, so that we're looking at the value of CME rather than just the credit. Yes, sort out the credit. So for the third point, the recognition of credits across borders, actually, that's more driven by the recognition of good CME across borders. And that, I believe, is where we will get the harmonization. If you look at good educational practice, rather than, oh, how do you convert one credit into another credit? That's becoming less of the discussion that's going on. Still a hot topic today, engagement of learners. Technology is coming along. The e-learning is becoming AI, where much more integration of how we engage with screens into our clinical practice or with the learners. This is now getting very interesting. Now, how do we use technology, and also what's the role of live meetings when it comes to engaging with learners, and how do we not just have them as passive recipients of education, whether it's online or live events, but engaging with them over a long period to actually look at those more sophisticated outcomes that we've only just started to think about in Europe. And the development of educational activities. We're seeing more guidance now. So, 5 years ago, to talk about interprofessional continuing education in Europe of any description really was not there. Maybe some of the Northern European countries might talk about the multidisciplinary group or something, but in the 5 years, we're starting to see more movement in this way. And actually, one of the developments we've seen is that EBAC in Europe now accredits interprofessional education as a recognized activity. So, yeah, it's still in its early stages, but at least it's part of the discussion now. And I think that's my last slide of the bringing us up to the present day. Thank you, Derek. Oh, thank you, Lawrence.
Right. So thank you, Eugene. So I think Derek and everybody watching, you'd agree that we really spent some time reflecting. I just have a couple of points that I'd like to cover as I looked back and thought things through. So one of the things that Kathy brought up, and I think Eugene mentioned as well, is that I think we call it the wrong thing. And we said this last time. So CME is the wrong name if we're talking about the sum total of everything that we do. Certainly single profession education within medicine is CME and will always be CME. But I think we need to start looking at the IPCE, interprofessional continuing education, and also a better understanding and agreement on the definition of CPD, continuous or continuing professional development, which, at least according to the most readily acceptable definition, encompasses CME and the other forms of single profession education. I think that we also 5 years ago talked about patients being omitted, and I think covering that patients are a key stakeholder. And I wonder if we haven't done a good enough job including patients in all aspects of CME, IPCE, and CPD, all the way from planning through execution and evaluation. One of the other things we talked about in 2014 was how we use the same faculty over and over again, and sometimes there's a good reason to do it. So this session is a good example of using the same faculty to reflect upon what was, to look at what is, and to think about what will be. But I think it's really important that we grow our faculty pool and that we don't use faculty for the sake of using them, but we use the right faculty who can teach. And it's our job to teach the teachers to teach, to make sure that the people that we use in our educational activities understand what they're trying to do and really get that point across. And the last thing I'd like to just reflect upon is something that Eugene said, but broaden it. And I think, Eugene, you did such a phenomenal job of really articulating the changes that have happened in Europe. But I think what we see from the IACPD, the International Academy of CPD Accreditors, is that it's beyond just Europe. And we're seeing a standardization of the approaches of how the accreditation systems are structured, which makes us as providers better, because we have to achieve the standards that they look to so that they accredit us or our programs. And Eugene, we'll have to agree to disagree. I don't think accrediting a platform is the same as accrediting a provider. I think it's a baby step towards provider accreditation, but you and I have both had the conversations directly with those folks, and they stopped short of saying that they would accredit a provider organization as opposed to a platform. So what I'd like to do now is turn it back over to Kathy and say, okay, Kathy, now that you've had a chance to reflect and readdress, let's look ahead again. And, you know, I wonder if, at least I looked at the last CME Palooza and I thought about my own predictions, and I wonder if it was more about a wish list from myself rather than a prediction and things that I hoped would happen rather than what I thought would happen. And there's two things that I think I missed. One, Don Moore published finally a follow-up to his 2009 paper, and it addresses, Derek, one of the challenges that came up in the morning sessions, which is how do you develop education so that the objectives match the outcomes? And I think he provides a framework in that paper. And I think something, Eugene, you touched upon, but I think it's bigger, is that the ACCME has done an incredible job of going global, reaching out to global organizations, collaborating and partnering, and really demonstrating again and again that it's really the advocate for the providers and for the learners and for the patients. And I wish that I would have said those two things in my predictions, but I'm glad that they happened and I wanted to point them out. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you to say, what's it going to look like in 5 years?
Sure. So, in reflecting on where we are, I do see from the predictions 5 years ago, continued growth in the area of interprofessional continuing education, which I expected based on that, but it was also nice to see evolve, particularly going back to that chart where in 2014, I think 3 organizations had applied for joint accreditation, and now we're hitting 20 to 25 on an annual basis. So here's what I see in terms of the future. Absolutely more collaboration among organizations across professions. I think it's effective. I think as organizations or leaders in organizations, we're learning from with and about each other. And we're more effective when we combine resources and expertise and knowledge. So I would expect that to continue to grow in the future. I think leveraging continuing education, interprofessional, whatever component as a strategy to address public health issues, again, is going to continue to move forward. Right now, we're looking at the opioid crisis, as a significant public health issue, but there's going to be another public health issue and another public health issue. Also, health and well-being of everybody in the healthcare professional workforce, and leveraging that. Right now, the National Academies of Medicine have leaned into this space, and I expect that will continue to happen. I expect more professions to be engaged in joint accreditation for the value proposition, and that's not to minimize single profession education, because they each do that very well, but also the opportunity to collaborate among accreditors and make it simpler for providers to choose what works best for them. I'm hoping, I think this is a little bit more challenging, is less of an emphasis on time as a metric of learning. It is the current currency. It's easy to add and subtract, but it really is not meaningful in terms of learning and change. One area that I think is underrepresented is the role of continuing education in areas like quality improvement, when you're doing a research study, when you're looking at implementation science. All of those areas very often include some sort of educational intervention, but very rarely do we award credit in those areas. And I think the whole growth of CE-CPD being more flexible, awarded, just in time, where it matters to the learner, and to meet, to address practice gaps in wherever healthcare professionals are working, is something that I hope continues to expand in a more flexible model. I definitely think we'll see more engaging patient and family. Again, the accreditors have used their commendation and distinction criteria as an incentive. But hopefully, as organizations or providers operationalize that, they will also see the value and continue more. Continuing as more organizations do interprofessional education, I think will expand the body of evidence. And I do want to note there is an article that was just published in the Journal of Continuing Education in the Health Professions that is about interprofessional learning to improve communication in challenging healthcare conversations, what clinicians can learn from each other. Really nice outcomes of the different professions and engaging together in an interprofessional activity. And I hope that regulators, certifying bodies, and healthcare organizations support the need for their healthcare practitioners to engage in interprofessional education. And that means they're going to have to set up practice settings that reduce silos. They're going to have to align rotations together, things like that, that the system needs to change in order for individual healthcare practitioners to engage together. And so that was kind of the CE-CPD space. I also wanted to note that I'm hoping, based on all of the efforts that we're putting into and the recognition of how important the health and well-being of our workforce is, that we will see improvements in overall health and well-being. I do think we're going to have to explore how to integrate more AI and big data into CE-CPD. So what are the skills that not only healthcare practitioners are going to need for the future, but what do healthcare educators need to know and incorporate into their educational content and or design? And increasingly, as Eugene mentioned, a global perspective to CE and CPD. Different countries are at different stages, but we have the opportunity even across country borders to learn from, with, and about each other. And I've participated in several recent international meetings of stakeholders, and we do find that there are common themes, at least in practice, among different countries, and we might as well use our combined expertise to leverage and address those. And the last thing I didn't include on the sign, but on this slide, but I think is important, is leaning into growing our healthcare workforce in terms of diversity. I think that will just benefit all of us, and there's a lot of research that demonstrates that. So those were what I see in the future for the next 5 years. We do, actually, Derek, if you go back, these slides will be posted, right? And so I did include
I can post them, yes. I can put them up.
Yeah, so articles that may be of value, and also links into the different resources that I've discussed that people who are listening or now or in the future might be able to use.
Got it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I'll do the same actually, and pull together references. I don't have that as the last slide, but yeah, I've also sort of put together a few points about the future, and I think that most of them are sort of personal prediction, maybe a wish list. I don't know how this will go, but yeah, what Kathy described right at the beginning, this criterion 24 of the ACCME, the accreditation with commendation, I think we're going to see this much more in Europe. And I'm nice provocative little statements. The patients now have a voice in CME CPD in Europe. I mentioned earlier, the FPA Code of Practice was published a couple of months ago. And there's a patient advocacy group in Europe called Mental Health Europe that actually stood up and said, you know what, this doesn't address our opinions and objectives, within the scope of how we see drug companies providing medical education in Europe. And it was the first time that I think they were exposed to this kind of message. And they actually coordinated an open letter. They did approach a large number of organizations. I'm a co-signatory of it as European CME Forum, but CPME, and a sort of a major European organization, so the Standing Committee for Medical Practitioners in Europe, that lobbies the European Commission. It's at that level. They're co-signatory as well as other organizations. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, what are, as a group of disparate organizations, actually finding concerns about, and it was just a few things there. And really, in my personal opinion, it just boils down to lack of transparency of how industry can be involved in medical education. But it's getting there. And so just looking at, the past 5 years, industry with all those evolutions actually has driven quite a bit of CME standards, but the way that the International Academy has sort of taken over, they've taken over the baton now. And as Lawrence, thank you for pointing out that it is a global initiative. And they're the ones who are actually now sort of saying these are the standards that we expect of our providers and relationships, financial or others, that we expect within CME programs. So I think this is an exciting time. And of course, when the patients get involved, this is now moving things even further than we've seen in Europe to date. I mean, the medical profession can be seen as a very conservative group, and where we see changes either coming about through a crisis or new data. This is new data now. I think that the House of Medicine that's been controlling CME will now change. And actually, to your point, Kathy, sort of looking at how that ties in with big data, we are seeing now more access to data in Europe and an awareness, whether it's through the QI functions in hospitals or general public health issues. There are groups out there joining the dots saying, we've got a problem here. What's the answer? We've got a CME system in place. Why aren't we using CME, whether it's called CME, CPD, whether it's accredited or not? There is a way of addressing gaps out there that these new groups that are sitting on data can make available. So I'll see these two portions actually joining together much more. Overall, this professionalization of CME CPD, we're seeing it in the medical societies. They are hiring PhD educationalists, professional educators, people with experience of running education. It's no longer just people who are good project managers in some other field being involved here. We are seeing well-educated educators driving a lot of medical societies, CME programs, and their other education. The professional providers now, again, that this group of professional companies are working within a framework of expectations from the accreditation bodies and others. Their standards will go up, and we will see, as we see in the providers in the US and Canada and other places where we've got more mature environments, I'm sure we will see more of those in Europe. And the accreditation bodies will respond. We're already seeing, just in the past 2 years, how these are changing, move away from that 1 hour, 1 credit blinkered thinking into what do the learners need? What do they want? How can we create education that's actually effective? How do we measure it? How do we tie this in? The answer is not 1 hour, 1 credit packages of information. And in this, we're seeing that also the faster moving accreditation bodies are accrediting more activities. You know, the standard sort of UEMS, ACME, we accredit roughly 2,000 activities a year. Just the Royal College of Physicians in the UK accredits 4,000 activities a year, small proportion. But in Germany, where they use much more CME, they accredit 400,000 activities a year. You know, the system is really sort of taking off as they're looking at the value of CME to their audience. So we'll see much more of this. And I think I've summarized at the bottom here. There'll be more of a focus on the value of CME, whether it's called CME, CPD, or whatever it is. Just we're going to move away from the credits of the bureaucratic exercise and actually look at high value education. I think that's my final point. Thanks.
That is fantastic, Eugene. Derek, we have about 1 minute left. I'm going to give one quick overview, and then I'm going to ask Eugene and Kathy. A question came in that says, what area needs most improvement in the next 5 years? You have 3 words to summarize that up. So
and you pick one area, not all.
Right, one area. So the things I look forward to is we're going to move from self-directed learners to directed self-learners. We have to act as guides for the learners. We can't expect the learners on their own every time to be able to find what they need to find. So educators become guides. We're going to see more scholarship and publishing in the literature in CME, as Kathy talked about it. And where we need improvement is we need to remember why we're doing what we're doing and remember why the learners are there to learn. So if we remember the why, we'll succeed. Kathy, what's your summary?
What was the question? I'm just going to say team-based learning.
Team-based learning. And Eugene?
I'll, not a sentence, but recognition, respect, and engagement with CME.
Then Derek, back to you, my friend.
Great. Thank you all very much. That was really great. I had a lot of nice comments. People were enjoying the session. I have a whole group in Texas who is watching us on the big screen. So hi, everyone.
Hi, Texas.
Yeah, that was really great. I need to rush through these because Scott's chomping at the bit to get his up. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Remember, if you have not already done so, please take our survey. It's right on the live page of the website, right above this. Yeah, right above the video that you're watching. There's a little link to take your survey. Take you 60 seconds to do. Maybe 7 questions. To view the next session, which is coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern, CME fads gone for good or coming back around again. It should be a good one. Sponsored by Creative Educational Concepts. You'll just have to refresh your screen. Scott will have the new video feed up here in a minute or 2, and we'll be good to go. Thank you all again, Lawrence, Kathy, Eugene from Spain. Appreciate you coming on, and we will see all of you again soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.